as our speaker today. Uh, Astrid did her undergraduate degree at the Open University and then spent a number of years as a drama teacher, or technically, I think it's called a communication, speech, and drama teacher, teaching children from 6 to 18 years of age. After that, she completed her PhD at Birkbeck, University of London, investigating, so the title is Evaluating Educational Interventions. And Astrid's project was innovative in that she had like a 1 foot in the academic camp and 1 foot embedded in a commercial education provider, and gained some invaluable experience understanding how to evaluate the kind of techniques that work in a classroom. Astrid is now based at York University and a postdoctoral fellowship. So I would say educational neuroscience is part of the evidence-informed approach to education. We want to know what methods, what approaches are effective in classrooms and schools in improving educational outcomes and well-being. But schools and classrooms are really complicated places. It's really hard to do these kinds of evaluations. So I'm absolutely fascinated to hear about the lessons that Astrid has learned from her research. So I'll hand over to her. She's going to talk about methodological issues in evaluating school-based interventions. Over to you, Astrid.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Michael. Michael was my PhD supervisor, and I submitted my thesis in October, and I'm just about to have my viva. So all fingers crossed for that. But as Michael said, my PhD was essentially an evaluation of a complex school-based intervention with lots and lots of different levels to it. So I had to get really, really savvy at kind of unpicking lots of different kind of implications of the methods that we were using. And I'm now seeing a slightly different side to things because at York I'm working on a kind of large scale cluster randomized trial of a literacy intervention. So again, you know, another really good opportunity to get up to scratch on these method issues. So I thought it would be useful to provide a commentary, essentially, on some of these issues in evaluating school-based interventions. I'm going to start off with just a really kind of broad overview. So what is evaluation in education? And I found this really nice quote from schoolings.org. So evaluation is a procedure that reviews a program critically. It is a process that involves careful gathering and evaluating of data on the actions, the features, and the consequences of a program. So again, there's sort of three components there. Its objective is to evaluate programs, improve program effectiveness, and influence programming decisions. And the reason why I've highlighted that last bit is that is really why evaluation is kind of so important and often, such a hot or even contentious issue at times, because it actually influences decisions that we make about the processes and the practices that we do in classrooms. And it's important because, you know, as educators, I haven't been a teacher myself, we want to know that these practices and these interventions that we're doing in our schools, that we're putting our time and our resources into, are actually effective at supporting our students' educational outcomes. When we're deciding what we're going to invest in, we typically ask some questions, which you've probably heard before. When we're talking about specific interventions, we might say, does it work? Does it actually support these outcomes? And when we're talking about practices in general, we might say, what works? So obviously we have things like the What Works Clearinghouse and the EEF and such, which try and produce guidance over what practices in general support learning outcomes. And they're very important questions to ask, because we found that it is possible to waste time and money on practices that don't really make any difference. And the example I've picked on here is learning styles, particularly the VAK, visual audio kinesthetic model, because while it's very intuitive for teachers to use learning styles and think learning styles are really helpful, because we know that every child has kind of a personalized way of learning, using that specific model has been found not to result in improved learning outcomes. And in some cases, they have found actual detriments to learning by using these kind of practices. So we know that there are some practices that you can put a lot of time and a lot of effort into, and they make no real difference. So if I had to summarize some of the challenges currently for evaluation in education, we have developed some really robust bases of theory to support practices. And also the interest in integrating research is higher than ever. But we still find some issues in the translation of evidence into practice, which kind of implies that there is kind of an underdeveloped or possibly missing, in some cases, sort of gap in the middle regarding the actual interfacing of research and practice. So that's one big challenge. And the other one is that the majority of interventions in use that are actually being used in schools currently actually haven't got an evidence base. So it's not that they're not working, it's that we don't know if they work or not. And what that indicates is that there are essentially some barriers to conducting these evaluations in the first place. And why might some of these issues be happening? Well, as Michael alluded to, it's because there's a lot of complexities to conducting these evaluations and accumulating evidence in education. So some of them being the profiles of the students that we work with are very diverse. So we're often working with what in research we call heterogeneous samples. So there's a very wide array of abilities and profiles of students. The outcomes that we're trying to address are very many, and they're often sort of overlapping or kind of interrelated. Even well-being and kind of academic outcomes, they're very sort of interrelated with one another. So interventions and classroom practices are not always applied in context as intended, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go on, particularly the concept of fidelity and adapting practices. And also these methods of evaluating might not work in every context. So there's a lot of sort of complexities about educational evaluations that make it more difficult to do this kind of stuff. And as I go on, I'm going to try and think about this and essentially, weigh it all up and say, what can we do about all of this to try and improve the way we do evaluations and ultimately make the results more informative for decision making in the end. So with that in mind, my two aims are going to be just to outline some of these methodological issues. I'm going to try not to turn it into like a statistical lecture. I'm just going to sort of pinpoint what are some of these key issues with evaluating classroom practices. And we can, if you want to go into it more in depth and questions, we can. With some case examples. So I have a couple of invented examples and a few real examples from the literature as well. And then in the second part, I want to talk about some recommendations for best practices in evaluation, coming especially from the International Roundtable event and the briefing paper that came from it, which the CEN has recently published in Mind, Brain and Education. So part one, we're going to think more in depth about some of these issues in evaluating school-based interventions. So I'm going to start off with a little invented example here. So I'd like you to meet Bob and Becca. So here we have Bob and here we have Becca. So Bob is a researcher. He has actually developed an intervention to improve maths outcomes based on a well-evidenced learning theory. And he has already done some small-scale efficacy testing that showed promising effects. So efficacy testing is just kind of doing the intervention under ideal conditions in a lab setting or somewhere you have a lot of control. Whereas an effectiveness is when you do it in the real setting, in the classroom. And then meanwhile, we have Becca. So Becca is an entrepreneur. She has actually developed also an intervention to improve maths outcomes, but hers is based on her prior experience as a teacher. And she has already trialed it in a few schools, and she's got lots of great feedback from teachers who say it's really helping and it's really improving their students' outcomes. So both Bob and Becca want to evaluate their interventions, and they want to see if they improve the students' math skills when they're used in real classrooms, i.e. moving from efficacy into effectiveness. So here is a little overview of their evaluation journeys and sort of what happens. So because Bob has done some efficacy testing and he's got some kind of evidence that looks promising, he's able to get some government funding, which is quite considerable. And because of that, he's able to look at kind of a large scale trial, sort of a cluster randomized trial that you might see. Becca, because she doesn't really have that kind of backing of theory and efficacy testing, she kind of has to reach out to other types of funders, and she ends up with not quite so much money, so she's not able to look at that really, really large scale trial like Bob is going to do. So Bob, once he's got his money, he goes out and he recruits schools, and he's able to randomize his sample. So he's able to randomly allocate some schools to the intervention condition and some schools to a control condition. Now, unfortunately, what happens after the randomization in Bob's case is that some of the schools in the intervention condition actually drop out. So for various reasons, schools might pull out. They might say it's no longer convenient for us to take part in this intervention at this time. And so because of that, you can end up with an unbalanced sample and not enough students in the intervention condition to actually kind of draw conclusions. He also runs into some kind of administrative issues with schools. So obviously schools are very, very busy, and he wants to conduct assessments in the schools, but they're quite slow kind of actually conducting the assessments and getting back to him. So because of that, he ends up with kind of not a proper baseline because some of the students had their tests like right at the beginning of before the intervention happened, and some of them have a lag of a couple of months where the intervention has already started, and then they still haven't had their assessments done. So he's kind of got a bit of a compromised baseline, which is also a problem. And then he also receives some feedback from teachers, which is that the intervention that he's asking them to do doesn't really fit well with what they're already doing. They don't really see what the benefits are over what they're already doing, and they're finding it a bit hard to actually implement in the classroom. So there's some kind of acceptability issues there with his intervention as well. Now, Becca, meanwhile, has slightly different issues. So first of all, she's not able to randomize because her intervention is aimed at a particular sample of students which have quite specific learning needs, and they're sort of self-selected for the intervention. So she's essentially not able to actually randomize her students to conditions. She's also not sure what measures that she should use. She's finding it difficult to find measures that are actually validated in her sample of her population of students. And as well as that, she has some issues with her longitudinal data, so quite a few absences and quite high attrition, which actually means that she ends up with an underpowered sample. And the sort of consultancy that she's working with tells her that, you know, we haven't got enough numbers to do what we need to do. So ultimately, even though they've both come at it from very different positions and very different methods, the outcome for both essentially is the same. So they are both end up with this message that your intervention doesn't work. So yes, as I said, they've come at it from very different starting points, but they've arrived at the same outcome for different reasons. And ultimately, the question that they both have at the end of it all is, did their interventions really not work, or were the sort of limitations of the evaluations and the methods that got put into place such that it is not possible to draw a conclusion? And this is something that happens in evaluations all the time. So using some of that as a kind of a jumping off point, I'm going to lay out some of these major method issues and evaluations, which we will have already come across some of them. So the first one is this issue of efficacy versus effectiveness. So as I mentioned, efficacy is when you test something under ideal conditions, and then effectiveness is when you're testing it in the actual context. And essentially it is an issue of ecological validity. So meaning, is it actually working under the situation with the kind of population that it's intended for? And this can be a big issue because a lot of interventions show promising effects under efficacy testing, but then you put them out into the real world, and because of all these different factors, it's actually really, really hard to establish whether they are effective or not in the real world. So efficacy versus effectiveness is the first big issue. Secondly, we have this issue again, which Becca ran into, of statistical power. So statistical power is essentially your chance of finding a real effect. So is the intervention effect that you're observing, is it just happening by chance, or is it likely to be a true effect that is occurring? And the issue of statistical power is firstly an issue of sample size. So you need to have a big enough sample to actually be able to pick out that it's almost like a radio signal, the signal that's running through of the intervention effect. But it's also an issue of analysis method, because the more complicated your analysis is, and the more kind of factors that you try and take into account, which is this issue of covariates, so factors such as the gender of the students, the cognitive ability of the students, anything that is kind of relevant to the outcome that you're looking at. If you try and include all of that and you don't have sufficient statistical power, then you are very unlikely to actually find an effect. So yes, statistical power is also a big issue, especially if you end up with a lot of dropouts, like Bob did in his example as well. So then we have this issue of what measurement instruments can you actually get, and have they been tested in the population that you're working with? So again, Becca ran into an issue where there were no kind of valid instruments for her particular sample of students. You then have an issue of method of allocation to condition. So is it randomized or is it non-randomized? Do your students kind of end up in a condition by chance or by sort of self-selection, their sort of individual characteristics, or even practical constraints might be a reason why, oh, this class happens to do this lesson every week on a Thursday, so they're gonna do the intervention. And also the type of control condition. So are they on a wait list? Are they just a passive control, we would call that? Or are they an active control? Are they actually doing something? And an active control tends to be a more rigorous method, but it's also harder to sort of put into practice. And then this issue of fidelity, which is essentially how well is the intervention being carried out in practice, and we'll come back to that. So there are also these sort of three underpinning epistemological issues. So an epistemology essentially means what are the questions that we're asking, and how can we sort of know the information that we want essentially to know. And the three main issues I would say are causality. So essentially, did this intervention actually cause the effects or the change in effects observed? We then have mechanism. So what are the features or the processes of the practice that led to these effects? And then an issue of generalizability. So will this practice actually demonstrate its effect in a different context to that where it was tested in, right? So this is another issue, efficacy to effectiveness, but also from school to school. So something that works well in one school might not work well in another school. And you will hear teachers and practitioners ask, well, it's all very well and good for them, but will it work for me in my context? And the other issue with causality, mechanism, and generalizability is that they are actually all interrelated as well. So, for example, to have an indication of mechanism, you really need to know that the intervention or the practices are causing the effects that are being observed. And likewise, to be able to generalize, you need an indication of mechanism, because you need to know what is actually causing the effect, so that you can transfer it between different contexts. Because if you don't know what is causing it, then you actually don't know what's the key ingredients that you need to keep consistent, make sure that it works in different schools or different contexts. So these issues do have implications for methods. So what we're asking and what we're aiming for actually does influence how we go about doing it. So one of the methods that we see a lot in education is randomized controlled trials. It's a very rigorous method. It's a sort of high-level method which uses this random allocation of participants to either a treatment or to a control group. And essentially, the reason why randomized controlled trials are so important is that they give a very strong indication of causality. So they say, yes, we can tell from this method that this practice did cause the effects or the change that we observed. Now, there are a couple of issues that I wanted to pick on with RCTs, mainly because they'll become relevant to more of the discussion. So as I said, they're a rigorous form of evaluation. They've played a very important role in developing the evidence landscape, but there are just a few issues to sort of pick up on. So I wanted to highlight that they were sort of developed in the context of medical trials, particularly pharmacological trials. And that's important mainly because in those types of trials, the features of the population are generally consistent. So they have a particular illness with a cause and symptoms that are known. And again, the chemical or the physiological mechanism of the drug is known. And as we've already discussed, this is often not the case in educational trials. We don't know some of this stuff. And essentially what that means is that this variance, which is created by these factors and these other unknowns, might be part of the reason why we see kind of small effect sizes in education compared to health studies. As I've highlighted, randomization is not always feasible, and also randomly allocating condition doesn't sort of magically fix all forms of sampling bias. And in fact, as we have seen / will see in another example, randomization can actually sometimes create problems or create bias. And finally, there is also this issue of it's a little bit artificial sometimes, even when you're assessing effectiveness, not efficacy. So when you're in a randomized trial in schools, participants usually have a lot of incentives, they're monitored a lot, they have a lot of support that they might not actually achieve under non-trial conditions. And this is an issue for scalability, essentially, because you can do a trial, you can have a lot of support and etc. And then the second that moves into a school where that's not the case, then you might find it's not going to work, and it doesn't. It sort of falls apart a bit. So yes, essentially it's an issue for generalizability, because it might be more likely that they'll achieve effects under the RCT conditions than under actual sort of real world conditions. So here is another example of methodologies. So this is quite a popular method these days, cross-slide panel modeling or structural equation modeling. And essentially what these, it's a type of analysis method really, and you can do it within the context of an RCT, but you can also do it under other sort of quasi-experimental designs as well. And essentially what this kind of method is trying to get at is mechanism, because you can see how, I don't know if you can actually see my cursor, but these, what they call cross-lagged effects. So for example, here, reading anxiety, you can see what these effects, what effect these other factors are having on the main outcome, which in this case is reading ability. But then you're also getting a causality because you can see for example, if you include the group dummy up here, you can see whether the group is actually having an effect as well. So you can get two things with it. You can get a mechanism and you can get a causality. And then finally, if you conduct what we call a process evaluation, which is many different kinds of ways of doing the process evaluation, often qualitative. You can do observations, focus groups, diaries, interviews. You might see, something called an evaluation of acceptability, which looks at, again, how well is this sort of fitting into the classroom and how acceptable is it amongst the practitioners. What that is trying to get at is mechanism, but also generalizability, because again, it gets at the factors that actually make the intervention transferable between these different contexts. So what is, again, what's the core issue, and how do we move that between different settings? So just a little more on fidelity and implementation factors, because again, as I've sort of alluded to, it's quite important that you have, teacher buy-in, and you have teachers who are sort of willing and able to conduct these interventions. I'm sorry, by the way, if you can hear honking. There's a lot of weird honking going on outside the CBCD at the moment. Yeah, hopefully it's not disrupting you. So yes, fidelity. Essentially, what the evidence has shown is that a program that follows the intervention model closely, or is well implemented, generally achieves better outcomes, and vice versa. So if there are issues with fidelity, and the intervention is not being carried out as intended, then you generally see worse outcomes. But at the same time, there's some nuance here, because if you're kind of overly prescriptive about your intervention, then it doesn't really support lasting change. It makes it harder for teachers to carry it out, because there's, again, a lot of stuff happening in classrooms. So you may not be able to do, let's say you've got a half-hour intervention every single day, and then on one day you've got, everybody's gone swimming, or everybody's got a sports day, or, suddenly your fidelity is a little bit compromised, right? So there's lots of things that can happen in schools that can throw off fidelity. And also it must be noted that some teacher adaptations can actually improve the effectiveness of intervention. So there is some evidence, for example, that teachers that adapt the intervention in such a way that increases the motivation of the students to engage, makes it relevant to their interests and that kind of stuff, can actually improve outcomes. So essentially, there needs to be some nuance here with fidelity. There's got to be some scope to flexibly change and apply practices in different contexts, but at the same time, not awareness that not to alter these mechanisms, these core key ingredients, because that can create what my colleague Andrew Watson calls a lethal mutation. Which I think is a really nice term, because it highlights that, if you change that one thing that is really important to causing the outcome, then you've essentially, again, the whole thing has kind of fallen apart because you've lost that key ingredient. And obviously, to know what that key ingredient is, you need to understand the underlying theory and to actually support that. So here are just a few real evaluation case examples to, again, draw out and kind of highlight some of these points. The first one being SEAL, so social emotional aspects of learning, and you can find the original paper was Humphrey and colleagues 2010. So this was actually a UK government evaluation of kind of a whole school initiative to social emotional learning skills. And what they were trying to do was improve the students' SEL skills, also create like a whole school improved kind of well-being support environment, essentially. Now they immediately had an issue because it was quite a large scale trial, but they actually couldn't randomize because of the recruitment method. It was essentially whatever schools like opted in to the program were the ones who did the intervention, and then they had sort of matched control schools who were, again, non-randomly allocated. And they had very, very mixed findings. So essentially, I don't know what is going on out there. It's very, very honky outside. Sorry. But so what they essentially found was, as I said, mixed findings. But overall, the big thing that people sort of took from this trial was that the students' sort of perception of teacher supportiveness and just the general quality of the school actually decreased, which is obviously not what they were going for. It's the exact opposite of what they were going for. And essentially what they did a process evaluation alongside it, and sort of the reasons that they identified for that were the staff will and skill, firstly. That's a very important quote, because the teachers, again, a bit like in Bob's example, didn't really see what the point of the intervention was. They didn't really see the benefit of it over what they were already doing for SEL in their normal teaching, and also quote unquote patchy implementation. And what that means is that teachers generally were picking on bits that they felt comfortable with and confident doing, and kind of ignoring the bits that were new or unfamiliar. So essentially, that was a fidelity issue. They didn't sort of implement it as it was fully intended. So that was what they sort of attributed these findings to. So we then have a second example. So this was Bell, Building Educated Leaders for Life. And there are two papers associated with this, which is Siddiqui and colleagues 2014 and Gorard and colleagues 2015. So this is, Stephen Gorard, our colleague from Durham's evaluation. And what Bell was it was a summer school intervention, kind of imported from the USA, and they were looking at whether it could help students from low socioeconomic status backgrounds to sort of reduce learning loss over the summer and close some of those achievement gaps. Now, again, they ran into quite a few problems, and I will say that the first trial in particular was quite impromptu. It came in response to some sort of short-term funding that became available. So they had to make quite a lot of quick decisions. Now, the main thing I wanted to pick on here is that in the first trial, the randomization was not possible. Again, because of sort of the way that the students were selected for the intervention. But then in the second trial, which was a larger, properly randomized trial, the randomization actually caused problems. It caused inconclusive findings because they had the same problem that Bob did, which was that after the randomization occurred, they had lots and lots of dropouts in the intervention group. So that left them with not enough of a sample size to actually have any sort of conclusive evidence about how effective this intervention was. And then finally, I'll give you a little example from my PhD project, which was looking at Project Hero, Health Engagement Real Outcomes, which is a holistic, multi-pronged health mentoring program where a trained health mentor comes into schools and works with struggling students. And currently this is unpublished, it's in my thesis, but watch out for papers in the future. Now, we did run into quite a few issues, as you can see from my very, very brief bullet point here. So the first one being that, again, we couldn't find validated measures for some of the outcomes that we were interested in. So, for example, behavioral outcomes, we couldn't find something that really sort of fit our needs. And also some of the academic outcomes we wanted to look at, we actually couldn't access because we couldn't get the appropriate data sharing agreements with schools to actually use their data. So there is a point there about data systems and availability of these, these outcomes school data that we're interested in. Once again, randomization was not possible. So it's interesting how I've actually got 3 examples here where we once again couldn't randomize because of the way that the students were selected for the intervention. We couldn't do like an active control. Again, it was mainly because of the way that the intervention operated. We couldn't have like a comparable kind of inert intervention that because it would have taken way too much time away from the students' academic studies, and teachers don't like, students to like be doing something that's they know is not having any effects. So, this idea of a placebo is often not desirable in educational context because you're taking time away from learning. We had a lot of data loss as well, and we also ended up with a very small effect size, which, it might not reflect the scale of impact in real terms, especially because in this kind of intervention where you're it's like a mentoring intervention. You often find that the outcomes are realized over, almost a lifespan, or at least, 5, maybe 10 years, because it influences the kind of decisions that students make as they go through their lives. So this idea of short-term impact is also sometimes a difficult one when you've got something looking at like longer-term goals. So I just wanted to drill home. I know this is quite a bit of information, but why is it important to take in these factors in evaluation research? If I had to drill down on specific reason, it's because all of these problems ultimately impose constraints, right? What are we actually able to take from the study, and how do we interpret the findings based on the information that we've got? So how can we know, given, what can we know given the information and the quality of that information that we've got? And as I alluded to, many of these issues can be uncovered or kind of delineated through process evaluation, which again, we'll come back to in our recommendations. So if you sort of bound me up, tied me to a chair and asked me, how do we actually know if an intervention works or not? I'll give you my sort of 3 big points. So the first one is that we need to know what are have these features of the intervention been considered within the context of the evaluation, i.e. fidelity, i.e. implementation factors. Was it applied as intended? What were the features of the population? How well was it engaged with? How acceptable was it? And do we have data on these covariates where possible? And I think it is important to highlight this because often in papers, the intervention is described, but it's not, they don't go into these factors in a lot of detail. So that's a reporting thing that we can think about. Is there an indication of causality? So that could be through an RCT, a robust quasi-experimental design, QED, such as like a regression discontinuity design, which is one of our recommendations from the paper. Or, and this is important as well, potentially a combination of evidence from multiple evaluations. So one of the things I'm going to touch on is we need to get away from this idea of we go in, we do one evaluation and then we walk away. We actually want to think about doing some sort of longer term partnerships. That's one of the things that came out from our roundtable. And now there is an issue of effect size as well. So we ideally want a statistic, if we're looking at quantitative data, we want a statistically significant finding with an acceptable, in brackets, medium strength of effect. Now, again, I don't really want to make this into a statistical lecture, but essentially an effect size is a way of quantifying what was the amount of difference or impact the intervention made. And we have some statistics, including Cohen's D, Hedges G, beta values that you might see in papers. And there is some debate over what's to constitute an acceptable strength of effect. So it has been argued that 0.2 in like other types of study would be considered small. But because a lot of intervention trials come out with much smaller effect sizes, it has been argued that a 0.2 should be considered a medium size effect in an educational trial. But then if you look at someone like John Hattie and his visible learning project, he argues that an effect size of 0.4 or above should be considered better than average or better than normal. But essentially, there is debate over this. And my point on this is that if we're too strict with these cutoffs, it is probably a disadvantage, because of these features of trials and education. But ideally, we would like to see a medium strength of effect if possible. So these questions, does it work? What works? I just wanted to highlight, based on what we've talked about, that, they're necessary because we need to know what are recommended and what are not. And we need our recommendations to be simple. But at the same time, that, as you can see from what we've discussed, they might be a bit misleading in their generality. So, we should be trying to ask what is working for whom. So thinking about the population, under what circumstances, i.e. what is the context and why. So thinking about that underlying theory as well. And in line with that, we're sort of trying to think about a paradigm shift as such. So you might have seen this in my previous presentation on this for the CEN a couple of years ago. But essentially, instead of having this idea that there is a better method, and we should be always aiming to do that, it's thinking more about what are the advantages and the disadvantages of using different types of methods, and what can we know based on the type of method that we've used. So moving from this idea that there's a hierarchy of evaluation to more of a strengths and limitations, or a sort of matrix model of methods as such. And another way of visualizing this, which Michael actually suggested to me to do this, is this idea that we have sort of multiple factors that we're looking at. So what is the level of fidelity? What's the level of teacher buy-in? What kind of allocation method do we use? And they all confer different implications for our interpretation. And if you push up on one, then you might have to sacrifice others. So, for example, if you really push on the fidelity, then you might lose a little bit of teacher buy-in. But you have to decide whether that's worth it or not in your evaluation context. So just a little bit on our CEN paper. I would strongly encourage you to read the full thing. This is more of a bit of a taster for you to get you to think about downloading and having a read of the full paper. But essentially the paper is called Evaluating What Works in the Classroom, Best Practice and Future Opportunities. And it comes from our roundtable that we did a couple of years ago with Lassie Day in Université Paris-Cité. So we were very fortunate to be able to have this international roundtable, which brought together practitioners, researchers, and policymakers in education from all over Europe. And here is the whole gang in the picture here. And essentially what we were trying to do was think about these challenges and solutions for evaluating interventions and establishing what works to support these outcomes and close gaps. So what we've done in this paper is we've taken all of the data that we sort of talked about during that roundtable, and we've summarized the consensus that we came to, basically, from all of the presentations, all of the discussions, and we identified some challenges and solutions concerning 4 main themes. So the first one being who is involved and when, i.e., getting educators and other stakeholders involved, from the very beginning of the process was the general consensus for making our evaluations more effective there. This issue of a need for methodological innovation. So again, more and kind of better methods for coping with and kind of modeling these issues of complexity in schools. Communication issues. So how do we actually communicate our findings? Again, do we, have layperson summaries? Do we, try and find other ways of getting our messages out there from the results of the evaluations, and reaching consensus as well is a really important issue there. And finally, this issue of kind of understanding and use of evidence by educators and policymakers, because it's all very well writing lay summaries and such, but again, if people don't have the sort of skills to engage with that, or even the will and the skill, to use that term from the SEAL evaluation, then there's not a lot of point. We can say it as nicely and as briefly as we want, but if there's not the will and there's not the skill to engage with it, then there's not a lot of point. So sort of this brings us neatly back to what I mentioned at the start of the talk, which is that, we've got these two types of issues. There are these barriers to actually conducting the evaluations, but also this kind of underdeveloped translatory step between research and the classroom, which we need to address. So bearing that in mind, our kind of major recommendations, there are quite a few. Again, it's a very interesting paper that's got quite a lot to it. But if I had to summarize what our sort of major recommendations were, we would like a lot more co-constructed research, bringing in practitioners and other stakeholders right from the beginning. And again, not a sort of box ticking sort of collaborative research exercise, but a properly co-constructed, meaningfully co-constructed research that, really takes everybody's perspectives into account. We want to aim for sort of longer term evaluation partnerships. This idea of one-off trials, we want to see if we can get away from that, and also do combined process and impact evaluations, not just looking at impact with no sort of deeper look at the process. So again, when randomization is not possible, we suggested doing some rigorous QEDs with large sample sizes, and also to collect data on covariates as much as possible, again, so we can get at some of this underlying theory. And this, they're all challenging in their own way, but I feel like this one is particularly challenging, this idea that we need to work at the interface. We need to promote dialogue, knowledge exchange between these sort of two worlds, research and practice. So, for example, one of our ideas was, we need to embed research literacy training and initial teacher training, and also through internships and placements. And that's not only teachers having placements in research institutions, but researchers having placements in educational institutions as well, so that we actually have a proper understanding of each other's worlds and how to work together. And finally, this idea of consensus. So we need to aim towards developing consensus and communicating consensus and our recommendations should be balanced in terms of their broadness and their specificity. I think we gave an example of the UN panel on climate change and some of the kinds of recommendations that they gave. So there are a couple of interesting case examples. I won't go into this too in depth because I'd like to get to questions, but if you have a read of the paper, you'll read about some really interesting work that was done in France. So L'ARCIDE, for example, actually co-created and co-evaluated an intervention. So they used this platform, lea.fr, to actually get teachers involved at every stage of actually designing the intervention and then evaluating it. The researchers' role in all of this was essentially to take what the teachers were saying and to kind of operationalize it in a testable way. And because of this, there was a very high acceptability of the intervention, potentially very high generalizability, and really promising effects on cognitive outcomes as well. So that was a really, really interesting case example we talk about in the paper. And then I really, really like this one as well. So this is the Conseil d'Évaluation de l'École, which is a little bit like the EEF. So they work alongside the French government essentially, and they're currently doing a long-term iterative evaluation of practices in schools. And essentially, these 5-year-long evaluations, these schools are actually supported to set and monitor their own objectives. So there's kind of a balance of internal and external monitoring and support. And obviously, this is a contrast with the sort of the one-off inspection approach again, with a real focus on kind of raising overall standards among schools rather than just sort of maintaining standards and making sure everybody's, doing what they're supposed to do. And essentially what they're trying to do is establish a mixed methods key, so it's qualitative and quantitative evidence triangle. So they're not just using one type of data, they're bringing together multiple forms of data to create a kind of portfolio of evidence, essentially. And that is about it for what I wanted to say. So I'll just quickly summarize my points and we can move on to questions. So there are currently lots of opportunities to work towards enhancing our methods in education evaluation to capture and represent the effects that interventions have better. Some of these opportunities include developing new tools, new systems for data sharing, and again, some of these methods that model/account for complexity in the real world. So rather than asking if it works or what works, we should try and take a more contextual view, looking at who do these interventions work for, under what circumstances and why. And again, this could involve gathering a wider range of quantitative data as covariates, and also conducting these combined process and impact evaluations. And finally, there's a lot of room as well to work on this interfacing, this sort of connection between research and practice, so that we can facilitate evidence integration. So, for example, by embedding this research culture within the teaching profession, and having these sort of longer term created evaluations. So that is it from me. Thank you for listening patiently. And I will now take some questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Astrid. Fascinating stuff. Really interesting content. So if people would like to put any questions that they have in the chat bar, and then I'll ask them to Astrid. There are already a few there, but I will take chair's prerogative and throw in a general question first. So it all seems a little bit bleak. Like evaluation is really, really hard. So should we just throw up our hands and give up, or are there some good news stories? Do you think we're chipping away at getting bits of evidence and advancing an evidence-informed approach?
I definitely think so. And I do think that evaluations in general are noticing this. You know, I'm highlighting a lot of issues here today, but in general, our methods are advancing. We're using better methods to model complexity, and we are more aware of these sort of practical issues that happen than ever, and we're actually trying to sort of account for them. So there is definitely a movement at the moment, and I will say in the RCT I'm working on right now, we are doing our best to really sort of co-construct, to work with the teachers, to listen to their feedback, and understand what is making this acceptable. And we're also looking to see if, again, it's not even like a one-off focus. It's more of a, can we improve standards, like in general? You know, can the skills that we're actually imparting to teachers be used to, you know, raise standards of pedagogy and raise, skills in general through these learning science principles, you know. So I do think that, you know, it's moving that way, but it's important to, you know, keep the, I guess the reason I'm highlighting all this is we need to keep the nitty gritty, and we need to keep the end point in sight as well, so that we know what we're doing and why we're doing it. So that's what I'm trying to communicate today.
Excellent. Thanks. All right. So I'll go to the chat bar. A couple of questions from Catherine. She says, I wanted to ask two questions. Firstly, whether you have ever run studies where you have compared observational data of pupils with quantitative data. And then secondly, what issues have you found in obtaining or evaluating socioeconomic status data?
Yeah, so the first question, bringing observational data and like other types of quantitative data together. Yes, I have done that actually. So I did that during my PhD. We actually used observational data of how the intervention was happening. I went round and I was conducting observations, and I wrote that up as field notes. And I actually used that to inform our quantitative evaluation, because I was able to use that to actually make ratings of intervention quality. And then those ratings were actually applied as we did some linear modeling to look at whether they were having effects on the outcomes, and we found that yes, those schools where there was a better intervention quality happening, and it was, the intervention was better structured, and you know, the fidelity was better, the outcomes, they were positively related, so there was better outcomes overall. So yes, you can do it, and I would advise doing it, because again, it's a way of doing a more complex, sort of robust mixed methods evaluation, and it does work, I can say from personal experience. I can't remember what the second question was. There's something about SES.
Socioeconomic status data. Any issues around obtaining or evaluating SES data?
Yes, definitely. So I do think, first of all, and there's an issue with access, because a lot of schools that get involved in these evaluations in the first place are generally the schools that have the resources and the time and the interest as well, to actually be involved in them. So this is one of the issues with the research schools network, which currently exists, is that they tend to be, like, already better resourced, and if you're in a sort of low SES area, and you've got uh, a lot of issues with school children coming to school hungry, or not having proper clothes, or not having proper sleep, or whatever, it's actually very hard to sort of get them to the starting point where you can actually show you can actually work with those complexities. But at the same time, there is a lot of room with, and we've talked about this before, Michael, with when you have a lot of variants and sort of issues that are coming from these environmental factors, then there's also room for them to move. Because if you can address those environmental factors in some way, then it's not like there's like a specific limitation in terms of a learning disorder or something. You've actually got factors that you can change, and because there are factors that you can change, you can potentially see more movement there. So I'm not sure if that fully answers the question, but that's just from my experience on it.
Great. Let's move on to a question from Alice. She says, thanks, Astrid. Very interesting. Given the many methodological issues that can arise, and that some of these seem to be fairly universal stroke endemic to education research, is there a reliable way to conclude that an intervention does not work, or can it always be blamed on methodological issues?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it's sort of the inverse of the does it work? Yeah. I think you can almost assess it in the same way that you would assess, does it work? You actually need to look very closely at the methods. And if you can see that there were lots of issues, that could have compromised it, and they sort of found a null finding, or I actually didn't touch on null findings as such in this, but they're often misinterpreted, because it's often taken as a null finding means it quote unquote doesn't work. A null finding actually means it was sort of equally as effective as usual practices, when you're comparing usual practices to an intervention in education. But yes, I would say that yeah, don't just necessarily look at the outcome. You need to look at the method, would be my advice, and you need to see what are the limiting factors here, and actually apply your interpretation on whether it quote unquote works or not. But
Great. Yeah, I think it's interesting to flip it around sometimes. If you have a practice that seems, an approach that seems to work in practice, but you can't get it to work in the lab, what does that tell you? All right, let's move on to a question from Andy. He says, thank you. I see that your recommendations don't mention RCTs. Given the greater challenge in educational RCTs compared to medical RCTs, do you see the continuing patchiness of overall evidence from educational RCTs as likely to be a permanent challenge? Or do you think that it's a question of time and improved methods in order to get nearer to the level of industry norms found in medicine? Or is it just the fact that the greater funding in medical research is always going to make it more reliable than in education?
yeah, it's really, really interesting, because, health RCTs do find generally larger effect sizes, still overall quite small. So I actually have an extra slide here, which I wasn't sure if I was going to get to, which shows that, in health studies, they find a median standardized effect of 0.11, which is small. But actually the efficacy in education is half of that, 0.06, and the effectiveness was actually 0.01 in this study by Lottie, Forbes, and Inglis. But again, I don't want to we're not saying throw away RCTs. That is absolutely not what we're saying. What we're trying to communicate is, in these situations where RCTs are not possible, which is, as we've seen, it can be often the case in educational situations, how do we establish what is a good enough standard of evidence? That is what we're trying to get at, and that is the issue that we're grappling with, which is why we're not saying throw away RCTs at all. We're saying in these situations where it's not possible, we need to find some other means, hence robust QEDs, hence more covariate, hence mixed methods rather than simply relying on a single one-off trial evaluation. I hope that makes sense, and I hope that sort of addresses the question. It's not something that is easily solved, is what I will say. But in the long term, I think RCTs need to be part of the picture of evaluation research, and a very important part of the picture. But also we have maybe more of a portfolio approach to evaluation, a bit like what the Conseil is doing in France.
Okay, we'll just take a couple more questions. Lots of interesting questions have popped up. There's one from Richard who says, with Dylan Williams' wonderful quote in mind, that everything works somewhere, but nothing works everywhere. It sounds like we should be moving education research away from the binary what works, what doesn't work, and towards the identification of a pool of more promising bets based on their fundamental scientific constructs, and then helping educators to get those to work in their setting. What do you think of that?
Yeah, yes, I do think that is a very important point, and it sort of sums up what I'm saying in a way. The one word that stuck out to me was the word bets, because I do think that sometimes there is a quote unquote best bets approach in education. And I for another study that is actually being reviewed at the moment for publication, I interviewed a lot of, it was a sample of 14 CEOs from a global sample of intervention companies. And one of those CEOs raised a very interesting point, which is that, a best bets approach is, 14, if your best bet is like 50% right, then 49% of what you're saying is rubbish, essentially. was what their quote was. So yes, I would agree in the main, but also this idea that we need to gamble or somehow make a guess about it is something that we also want to sort of keep away from. And I'm not saying that's what you were suggesting, but it just made me think of sometimes there's we need to go with our intuition, whereas actually no, we want to be properly evidence-led. And again, we want to raise these overall standards of evaluation, even if that means just looking at it in a more complex and a more holistic way. That is essentially what we're trying to get at, is weigh things up and have these sort of different ways of looking at it. There we go, like that.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right, we will just take one final question from Nama. Now, she's a couple of questions. I'm just going to post one of them, which is a little bit focusing on your perspective as a kind of early career researcher. Nama said, as an emerging scholar who is also bound by the existing standards of the field, can you speak about any structural issues, e.g., related to getting grants, publishing, getting acceptance in the field, that you see with advocating for and enacting the sort of conceptual shift away from the established hierarchy for methods? Can it be done, Astrid? Can you do it?
Yes, I think it can be done. We've already kind of done it with Evolve, and I do think that sort of co-constructed sort of it was essentially a co-funded studentship that we did. So we were part funded by the ESRC and part funded by the intervention company, and it was a really nice opportunity to do that kind of collaborative work. It is difficult, especially because we have this hierarchy model, right? We have this idea that we need to be aiming for a specific type of evidence. But like I said, there is already more of a shift happening towards we need process and impact evaluations. We need, more of a complex strengths and limitations kind of approach. And, I'm not the only one saying this. This is very much coming from, other authors. So, Laura Althwaite at UCL, etc., are all sort of saying the same things. And there's a lot of evaluation work going on at UCL, which is following this sort of same approach already. So it is worth saying that this might sound radical if you're coming at it from a RCT. Yes, we need RCT kind of approach, but in reality, it's not that radical if you're actually within that evaluation sphere. This stuff is already happening, and I do think it will sort of continue to snowball and become more of the norm as the years go by. And I hope to be part of that.
Fantastic. So thanks so much, Astrid. We will wrap it up there. Thanks again for your questions. Sorry if I didn't get around to asking all of the questions. Let's thank Astrid again, and I look forward to seeing everyone back at the next Center for Educational Neuroscience seminar. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Actually, don't know if we're still recording or not.
Yeah, I guess.
Did we even record it?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Mahi, press go on that.
Stop share.
Lots of
Oh
nice
yeah, of course.
messages.
There it is. Stop recording.